Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us in this third meeting of the MaMo webinar cycle, Materializing Modernity, Landscape Architecture Anthropology Intersection in 20th Century Rurality. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So let me introduce myself. I'm Federica Pompeiano, and I'm a researcher at the Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Art Studies in Tirana, where I am developing the research project called MaMo, Materializing Modernity, Socialist and Post-Socialist Rural Legacy in Contemporary Albania, which has received funding from the European Union Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program under the Marie Curie Action Individual Fellowships. This webinar cycle has been organized within the framework of the MaMo project, and I would like to thank my host institution, both in Albania and in Italy, and my supervisors, Professor Nebi Bardosci, Professor Nicola Scaldaferri, and Dr. Olsi Lelai for their support in organizing this event. I am also grateful to the Ethnomusicology and Visual Anthropology Lab and the Department of Cultural and Environmental Heritage of the Università Statale di Milano for providing the means for the implementation of this webinar. I have already copied in the chat a few information about the organizational aspect of this webinar. And I would like to remind you that the webinar is recorded and that if you wish to do not appear in the video, simply you just have to keep your camera off as well as your microphone. At the end of the presentation, there will be room for comments and for questions for sure. But now let's see what happened today in our webinar. So today we will have two lectures that will focus on 20th century modernist rural planning and landscapes. So I'm going to introduce you our today's speakers, to which I'm very, very grateful for contributing in this webinar cycle. I have put first Cristina. So the first lecture should address the notion of uses of past in the conception and implementation of modernist rural landscapes, exemplified by two case studies that Cristina will introduce to us. So the first case study will be the Pontine Plain and Apulia in Italy, and the second case study will be the northern Greece countryside. Cristina Pallini is an architect and a PhD in architectural composition. She teaches architectural design studio at the School of Architecture, Urban Planning and Construction Engineering at the Politecnico di Milano. And her research on the relationship between architectural design, settlement, dynamics, and urban change has been funded by Italian and foreign institutions, including the Aga Khan program in architecture of the MIT, the Onassis Foundation, and the Newcastle University. She has collaborated in different EU-funded projects, and recently she has been principal investigator of two major EU-funded projects, such as the project PUMA, Planning, Urban Management and Heritage, and the Modscape project, Modernist Reinvention of the Rural Landscape. The second lecture will address rural planning and village design expertise in the former Eastern Bloc, and will discuss how to situate those rural built heritage artifacts in a wider historical perspective. And this second lecture will be presented by Axel Fischer, which is an architect, scholar, educator, and editor. And he holds a PhD in architectural composition from the Politecnico di Milano. He is associate professor at the Free University of Brussels in Belgium, at the School of Architecture La Chambre-Horta, and member of the Hortense Lab for Architectural History, Criticism, and Theory. His research interests are mainly focused on 20th century rural architecture and village planning history within the frame of agricultural modernization processes. From 2015 to 2020, Axel coordinating the European Collaborative Research Project Modscapes, Modernist Reinvention of the Rural Landscapes, which has been funded by the HERA call Uses of the Past Joint Research Program. So as you can understand, Cristina and Axel were colleagues working on a Modscape project. But now I think we should proceed by listening to your contributions. And meanwhile, if our participants have questions, they can write them in the chat. And at the end of both presentations, I will read them to Cristina and Axel. Or at the end of the presentation, the participant can also directly raise their hands and make comments and questions. So I leave the floor to Cristina and Axel. I don't know who will be the first.
No, Axel, as you wish. I can be the first and leave you the first.
Okay.
Can you hear? Oh, I can start. I don't know. Axel, you say. Okay, so I'm starting. Okay, I'm sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you, Cristina.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes. In a while.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we can see your screen.
So first of all, many thanks for your kind invitation. It was very welcome. Now I'm full screen. I have to, okay. So if there is anything that comes up, just tell me, because I'm kind of downsizing the icons to have full screen. So I chose to, okay, what's going on? Okay, I chose this title, Embedding the Past into Modernist Rural Landscape. I was trying to wrap up one aspect that for me was crucial in this study of this context of the Pontine Plain and Greece, which is precisely this notion of uses of the past, which was the title of the HERA call that we benefited from. So I'm moving into this notion of embedding the past into modernist rural landscape. I would like to anticipate what I mean and what, at least from the case study of the Pontine Plain, which is still ongoing because it's still a case study that we are focusing on in the researching and in the design studio in Politecnico di Milano. I mean, the past here is embedded. There are two aspects of the past that are embedded into these modernist rural landscapes. And one is like the long-term history. And the other is the reclamation side. The case is different for Greece, but let us start from the Pontine Plain. And I will start by underlining the fact that this site, as it is today, is actually a repository of projects done by many people and promoted by different clients and at different moments in history, and that brought about expertise in hydraulic engineering from all over Europe. And this process sedimented elements like water bodies, artificial water bodies, or deforestation of some areas, settlements. And all these, the vestiges of this long process of territorial change, became part of the modernist rural landscape of the 1930s, along with the technicalities of reclamation. And when I'm saying technicalities of reclamation, I mean referring to the building site and the different stages of the reclamation process that require infrastructure, like as narrow gauge railways or roads, villages for workers. All this past, which was rather recent as opposed to the long-term past, is trapped and crystallized into the existing built environment. I'm now starting with the repository of projects. And this slide is a kind of introduction to say that the place and the architecture of the cities, of the new towns in the Pontine Plain, namely Latina, Pontine, and Sabaudia, has been the focal for many scholars over the last decades, mainly historians and architectural historians, and from the United States, from Italy and Europe. And we added, what did we do original, because there is plenty of literature. We, of course, we had to go through this literature. We try to visit the local archives, get in touch with local population, thanks to the fieldwork that Modscapes was promoting. And we gathered some perspective view on this, which is trying to tie architecture, town planning, and territorial change. And as Axel was putting forth from the very early stage of the research proposal, this notion of landscape as a unifying concept. So let me now go into a more descriptive stage, which is like we are now entering, and with this picture, we are entering the reclamation authority in Latina. And you see that there is a rather big fresco depicting the plain has transformed after reclamation. A few notes, because this is a notion that I was using in my, ever since I did my PhD thesis, this notion of geographic theater, of trying to grasp the latent order inscribed in the geographical features of this area, which is the beginning of the story somehow. So you see Rome. We had some geologists, by the way, when we had our fieldwork and workshops. You see Rome, you see the Albani Hills, the Lepini Mountains, the Iranian coast, the Quaternary dunes, and the geographical features that are determining the fact that the area, ever since antiquity, was marshy. And because of that, it was also unhealthy because of malaria. And over the centuries, ever since the antiquity, repeatedly projects for reclamation were designed and partly implemented. So just a few of them, just to name the most important. One was done by Leonardo da Vinci, who was called upon by Pope Leo X Medici, and he surveyed the site, and he was the first to understand that in order to drain the swamp, there was a need of not just one draining canal, but rather a system which was consisting of perpendicular canals, because there was a need to drain not just the swamps, but also to give an outlet to the waters flowing down from the Lepini Mountains. Then, in the lower part of the slide, you see a project reclamation scheme conceived by Cornelis Meyer, a Dutch, who was called upon by Pope Innocent XI. So we here, the idea was also to have a settlements of Dutch immigrants in the plain. I mean, each of these projects deserves a special attention, but this is not the scope of the lecture of today. Finally, we come, I mean, we are jumping and we are arriving to the late 18th century. We have Pope Pius VI, who, I mean, there is a debate and a cult in Rome about the conditions of the Pontine Plain, so close to Rome and so depressed, so unhealthy, so wild. And the Pope is calling upon the hydraulic engineer from Bologna to drain the swamp. Here is the situation where when you, the lower part of the slide, you see the area which was permanently swampy, the area which was a seasonal swamp and the part that was swampy only after heavy rain. So this is the beginning of a systematic work of surveying and of designing and of embedding the past. So here we have this project itself was embedded in the final reclamation scheme, but here we have a clear revival of elements of the Pontine landscape of antiquity. And this revival is, in very concrete terms, has to do with the rebuilding of the Appian Way, the straight part of the Appian Way which had fallen in the decay, and so much so that travelers were moving on the foothills of the mountains. The reconstruction of a sweetwater canal, freshwater canal, parallel to the Appian Way and heading to the port of Terracina. The building of a system of staging posts along the Appian Way at key points of intersection with water bodies in the plain and the new canal. And so this system was at one and the same time a system for traveling from north to south to the sea, to the port of Terracina, but also to provide some basic service centers, namely the staging post, for the seasonal migrants who were moving, as I said, on a seasonal basis from the mountain to the sea. So these places were at one and the same time serving travelers along the Appian Way, but also they were equipped with mills and bakeries and public ovens that were serving like an east-west movement of people from the foothills to the sea, because the swamps, they were wild, but in winter, they allowed some activities, some productive activities like fishing, wood collecting, hunting. There was an economy, not a very rich economy, but there was life, at least in winter. So here it's very interesting because you see this grid, you see that perpendicular to the canal and to the Appian Way, there is a system of drains. And it's interesting because they were, you can read it in Rapini's report, there were different alternatives. One was to, the more rational was to follow the sloping, the most favorable sloping direction. But instead, the decision was taken that these drains were set at 1 Roman mile, at the distance of 1 Roman mile, perpendicular to the Appian Way. So here we see that let's say the landscape of antiquity is embedded in the new project. Some elements are rebuilt, like the canal, which existed in antiquity, and the Appian Way. And there is a new part, a new feature of this rural landscape, which is totally modern. Modern, I'm talking about the late 18th century, but following, trying to lay emphasis on the fact that this place could claim a Roman past. So we move. I mean, this is an important step in the history of the place. Is the work by de Prony, a French engineer who started collecting data. I mean, it's really a sedimentation of data of projects or interventions on the actual land. In this case, there was no implementation, but a robust body of data, including pluviometric data, collected in a scientific way, that was eventually fundamental for the subsequent reclamation projects. And here we see Italy in a picture of depicting Italy as it was divided into small states before unification. And to the right, you see that we can appreciate the fact that the Pontine marshes are very close to Rome, the capital, and that was one of the malaria-ridden area of the country. So, and all this idea of reclaiming the plain regained momentum after unification, and we have a number of projects, but in trying to raise this issue of embedding the past, and so far we have been talking about the long-term past, we need also to mention what was done in the early, late 19th and early 20th century, because even these elements were there, and they were fundamental. They were grafting points for the reclamation works and eventually for the new modernist landscapes. We could even here, this is a material, I should have said it in the beginning, that most of this material is not only me and my work, it's the work of people who have been working with me over the last years. And here we can see how the place was actually becoming a constellation of rural schools and anti-malarial stations. I mean, this issue of malaria is crucial because it's another element that attracted international attention to the place, because the problem of malaria was endemic not only in Italy and in Pontine Plain, but in many other countries. So having a clue of what was being done and could be done in the Pontine Plain was providing a testing ground and possibly a solution also for other countries in Europe and in the rest of the world. So we have here, there is no idea of any city, but the idea of spreading a system, capillary system, in order to be able to settle the area. And here in this kind of journey through history and approaching to the moment of the 1928, when Mussolini pronounced the famous Ascension speech, saying that cities were hazard for health, and that he was to promote ruralization. We cannot overlook the attempts, I mean, and here particularly by the Caetani family. Here we have a member of the family who was a prominent politician, who had an international stature, like, and here is a cover of the Times showing his face, and a member of families of popes who were among the large landowners who of the area, of the entire area. And it's amazing. We found a little booklet in Latina, and we understood, I mean, by reading the booklet and visiting the Caetani Foundation and the archive, that this man, before Mussolini took over, had the idea of reclaiming, or at least the land under his possession, and exploiting his properties, and some of which are outstanding sites, like the medieval town of Ninfa, which is attracting visitors, particularly from the UK, but from all over the world every year, the castle of Sermoneta. And it was like making a list of the properties and converting some of the properties into facilities for the reclamation. For example, the medieval town of Ninfa, which was a town from the beginning, according to Caetani. I mean, there is a project in the Caetani Foundation for rebuilding the town that would become a new town for the reclaimed countryside, while the castle at Sermoneta was to become an anti-malarial lab with a doctor from the US, and so on and so forth. And even the construction of rural schools was one of the issues that, I mean, it was all experimental, but it was the idea was that these vestiges of the Caetani properties dating back to the long history of their possession in the Pontine Plain would become elements of a new healthy and productive rural environment. So here is a map showing the property and some of the units that were had been identified to become key points of the reclamation system. And in the list, you can see the place, what it was, and what it was to become. So this notion here is rather clear, this notion of embedding the past, without any ambition at this stage to characterize the new rural landscape in modern terms by way of architecture and town planning, but simply converting what existed. It was a system by itself because it was connected by roads, some of the few roads that allowed this seasonal migration and allowed to cross and to pass through the woods and the swamps. So to have a system which was somehow dormant and giving it a new start. Here I am moving to the 1930s and to the I'm trying to demonstrate, to show, and again, here there is a PhD candidate, Emanuela Margione, who is doing this work. So I am also reporting on some reflections that are from her work that has been funded by Modscapes. The point here is to see that when you look at the new towns and we read the reports of Latina, Pontinia, Sabaudia, not only we read Italian architectural and town planning journals, but also foreign journals. And really, it was under the international spotlight what was going on there. There is always this idea that, first of all, that was before it was a swamp, there was nothing, and out of this nothing, the new towns sprang up. So here the point is I want to show how the towns, I mean, and the planners of Latina and Pontinia actually couldn't but, or they decided to embed elements, pre-existing elements, and giving them a new role in the new scheme. Here we, to the right, we have a map of the Italian Army Geographical Service dating 1922. So even before Mussolini's speech, 22 is the March on Rome. So it's when Mussolini takes over and holds power. And here is a very rudimental elaboration. Emanuela Margione has done much better, but it's just to give you a feeling of what was there. I mean, the grayish part was the forest. Then you see the Appian Way. There was a road by the sea, but at some point it was moving inland. The Rome-Naples Railway was newly built, and this red element, which was a tratturo. It was a sheep path, a large path for shepherds and sheep that were moving seasonally from the plain to the foothills. And this doorward path and the orange road, which was called Epitaph, because it was connecting, it was like heading to a point along the Appian Way when there was an ancient inscription with an epitaph. So this kind of fork system is actually defining the logistics center, one of the logistics center for the reclamation. And the logistics center is defining the center of Latina, and the two roads, Latina originally Victoria, and the two roads became the backbones of Latina's urban layout. Here we have a map from Casa dell'Architettura, and I try to give them the same orientation, so that you can see on the map in the map to the left, you can see quadrato and written in black, and which is the logistics center, and you see the reddish, the pinkish area is the area for the new town of Littoria to be built. I want now to take you to this crossing point and to see how this crossing point was formed and evolved almost like a Frankenstein from the logistics center to the center of Latina. In the left, you can see that there is an additional road, a road which didn't exist in 1922, and it was a road being built for reclamation activities. So, as I said, the past is long, the long past of this territory, but also the reclamation site, which gradually took shape. What was not dismantled, instead, it was crystallized in the new modernist landscape. So here is, you see Quadrato Littoria, so it's Quadrato, the logistics center, and which was reached by a narrow gauge railway, and the new town to be built. All around you see the woods. By the way, you see the contour lines, and it's obvious that Littoria was not built on swampy land, but on a dune, so it was not high, but not on a swampy land. And here, a comparison between the map that we saw before and an aerial view of Littoria dating back to 1932, 1934, we don't have the exact date, where you see the urban layout, the ring road. I mean, here there are many things. I mean, there are many things in this plan. There is the footprint of the pre-existing landscape, the notion of ring road, which was then quite the fashion, the three squares, the square of People's Square, the main one, and the Church Square below, and the radial system of roads, which was so harshly criticized by Le Corbusier. Here, I would like to point out that that's why I'm focusing on Latina and Pontina, because in the case of Latina, the point, like the part of the city, which is heavily loaded by elements of the pre-existing landscape, is the center, namely the main square, People's Square, Piazza del Popolo, where you would have the town hall, the workers' club, and the hotel, and the main representative place where public gatherings were to be held. Whereas in Pontina, as we shall see in a moment, the pre-existing landscape is crystallized in the perimeter of the city, not in the center. Here, the comparison is between the logistics center with the railway yard and the functional building. And you see that the geometry of the square and some elements of its layout are the same of the logistics center. In this map, you see I superimposed with colors rather abruptly, so you can more easily compare the map to the left to the map to the right. Here we have a chrysalid. We have the square in between, with still some buildings belonging to the logistics center, but the three sides of the square already defined by the new building built in 1932. And here is the aerial view of Littoria. We can see it better in this picture, and just made an attempt to name all the elements of the pre-existing elements that are still forming part of the new system. And here is some photographic aerial view of the time, where you see the new buildings being built, the town hall with its tower, the hotel, the workers' club. You see Viva il Duce. This, where you see Viva il Duce, that's a building of the logistics center, just like these two buildings with the pitched roof and this building here on the back of the hotel. So it's very interesting because many scholars who have written a lot about these cities, they not all of them, they go into the process, how it was built. They judge and consider the final outcome, but even though these cities were built rather quickly, that was not overnight. And it's rather interesting to see these intermediate phases. Here, it's a later photo, not much later. There is the church under construction, still some building on some of the logistics center. And you see this white road crossing the plain. In fact, some of the articles that we found about people who visited the cities under construction, they were calling them cities of roads, because the buildings were few, and the buildings that were built or those that were needed to define the squares, really that is a dominating factor and a common denominator of this of the new towns, and the rest was coming with time, and all the aerial view were showing this situation. So this is a kind of trying to synthesize and bring back, before we move to Pontinia, with this kind of zooming in and zooming out. It's an exercise that has been fundamental to understand this territory and its distinguishing features. Just some, we could, if the picture were big, we could make put more names, more dates, and really depict the construction, the artificial construction of this territory. And you see the Appian Way, the staging post, and it's very interesting, and you can appreciate it in this map, the fact that the grid, the 1 mile, the grid of one Roman mile, defined in the late 18th century, became the grafting point for a system of roads. I mean, this grid was extended and reaching the Litoranea and the road that was running by the coastal lakes. So even the infrastructure of the plain was grafted onto the previous hydraulic works. And this is with a change, because what is here depicted in yellow was initially conceived as a drainage system with the road serving the drains. During the time of the reclamation, from starting with 1928, actually the roads became more important than the drainage canal. So they were the yellow lines, they were transformed into proper roads and extended to form a system with the north-south roads. I mean, I want now to take you to Pontinia and to see how, in this case, I mean, we have seen that the two cities are really very different. Also because Littoria is built on the rocky soil, while Pontinia is really built on reclaimed land, and Littoria is not built in the 1 mile grid system, while Pontinia does. And once again, the logistics of reclamation and the timing of reclamation The new town is not built. They don't even know exactly how to build it. This town is the most mysterious because Le Corbusier rushed in Italy in 1934. He's trying to meet the Duce. I mean, there are books on, there is no need to but it's a really, Pontine is under discussion, and really he would like to have the commission, and he's doing his best to meet the Duce, but he doesn't make it. And eventually Pontine is built by the engineers of the Opera Nazionale Combattenti. But before the city, there is the grid. You see the grid of drains, and there is this Borgo Pasubio, this which is one of these places which were initially logistic centers. Then they became aziende agricole, agricultural companies. And from the very beginning, in the design phase, their buildings were designed with the idea that they would work like that for some years and eventually be converted from something else. So here, the periphery, if so to say, comes before the city. And the city here, we found this by chance. It was really serendipity. We were visiting the Museum of Terra Pontina. We found this and we saw the sketch, and the sketch is not exactly as Pontine is today. So here is the, as you see, it's some notes to understand the place. The site selected for the construction of Pontine that remained secret until 1935, when the city was started to be built, and the foundation was in December. The logistics service center, the road to Littoria. And you see how here the frame for the city to be built, it's set by the 1 mile grid system of drains and roads, which is, as we see it in this map, is dotted with the farm units. You see that the farm units are the little squares with another little black square, and they are all like a magnet. The 1 mile grid is because they are served by the road and they are accessible along the Migliare. The rest, I mean, all these are the allotments and the system of sub-drains and irrigation canals. Here, we found the plan, the original plan. It's on transparent paper by engineer Pappalardo for the building of Pontine. Here, you notice that this is the ring road, is really the threshold between the city to become and the countryside. This river is the river Sisto, which is a 16th century water body. The canal is also pre-existing the city, and the city is set on a different geometrical orientation, following the idea of theatrality. This idea that you would access from these points and you would have the view of the town hall with the tower, and from that other point you would see the church with the bell tower. So there is a scenic intent framed, cast into the system of the 1 mile grid. And here is this is a very nice view that we managed to find in the archive of the Italian Air Force. It took us a while, but finally we got them. We got the permission to, I mean, we cannot use it as we wish, but we can show them. So here is Pontine is built, the white roads, the city of roads. And here are some notes just to decode this modernist place. First of all, what is here unified, because it seems like fertile countryside, actually on the opposite side of the Sisto River, we have a deforested land in between the Sisto River and the sea, and the reclaimed land on the opposite side. then the city is actually built by the public buildings and buildings to host public employees. And these public buildings are like the diktat of the town hall, the workers' club, the fascist party headquarters, Casa del Fascio, hotel and post office. So, and paradoxically, these buildings are there. They have to be such big because they have to shape the square. The square is fundamental. It's really the embryo of the city. And we can see that when the inauguration ceremonies, this square is like is animated. It's like the theater of the mass behavior, and all the people wearing black shirts are gathering there, and the Duce is addressing. And so this is the main scenography for this to happen. And obviously these services are also meant for the farmers who are living in the area. And the number of inhabitants of the city is nice, because when you go to the archival material and you see the reports for each of these public buildings, they are very basic, but the report of the water tower is very interesting, because it says, I mean, this tank can accommodate such liters for a population of such. And so there is really the idea of the dimension of inhabitants, and how much the farm unit has to be big to allow the farmers to survive. And in the town, the element which is giving the correlation between the number of inhabitants and water is taken as a guiding principle. Other than that, we may notice, but this has been, I mean, the towers, I mean, the town hall, the bell tower, the water tower. And here is another nice view of Pontinia. Here is taken looking towards the Lepini Mountains. And I did the same trick. I put some captions to lay emphasis on the elements of this modernist rural landscape, which is actually a combination of elements surviving and being revived from different historical moments, like, for example, the Appian Way, which you see lined with pine trees and parallel by the canal that was rebuilt, as we said, late 18th century. The Migliare, late 18th century, upgraded the canal and the river and the farm units, the countryside, which is getting the edge in between the Migliare, are actually the edge in between the area for the city to develop and the countryside reaching the city. And here are just one of the news, if you go to Museum of Agro Pontino, they have plenty of newspaper, and this is nice because it's a French one, it's not an Italian one. So it's really, there is this epic of these cities being built out of the swamp, but this is rather a rhetorical statement. And this is Mussolini inaugurating Pontinia, and the square tested for the mass behavior a year after its foundation. And here is this is a picture we are. I think Alex Acorolia, who is working with me on this topic, he picked this picture, which is really nice because it's showing. It's a picture dating back to the 60s, and I mean, if we go to Pontinia today, we cannot have this effect. But when you look at this picture, really, the contrast is impressive, because the people with carts and the way they are dressed, it looks like the 19th century. But the buildings, really, this idea of modernity, these plain lines, simple volumes, and the contrast between the inhabitants and the buildings is rather eloquent. I'm now moving to the Greek case, where let's say there are many differences, and I will name just a few to mark the fact, for example, that it happens earlier. the fact that while the Pontine thing is a kind of, there is this fascist epic, in the case of the Greek reclamation work and rural development efforts, is actually the result of a huge refugee crisis, which is well depicted by this map, where you see all these little rectangle are divided into two. Left part is showing the ethnic composition of the area before 1922, the moment when refugees from Asia Minor are flocking into northern Greece. And the right part of the rectangle is the ethnic distribution after, when the refugees have been settled. So here there is a humanitarian crisis. The issue of nation building is rather compelling. There is an issue of border building, because this border with the Greek borders with Macedonia, Bulgaria also have been set in 1912. So settling people there instead of in other parts of Greece, it was also a political strategy to Hellenize the borders and give a survival to these refugees, but Hellenizing the border was certainly an issue. And the fact that whereas in the Pontine Plain, reclamation came first, in the case of Greece, settlement came first, and reclamation work were undertaken only in the 30s. The question of antiquity is also, I'm here trying to conclude, probably I will talk more faster about the Greek case. What is really interesting here is that Greece was under Ottoman domination for more than 4 centuries. Obviously, this is the place of Macedonia, Pella, the birthplace of Alexander the Great. But when the refugees arrived in the 1923, there was no excavation, no this antiquity, this latent landscape of antiquity was not there. But somehow what was there instead is this, like the Appian Way in the case of the Pontine Plain. In this case, the Egnatia Way played a crucial part because it was also an infrastructure available, and an infrastructure lining already some villages, and particularly the town of Yanica, which was a new town founded by the Turks, the Ottomans, in the 14th century. And we shall see, these are some maps done by a colleague from Thessaloniki, showing the reclamation works, and you see here that there is no village in the reclamation area, simply because the reclamation came afterwards. So when the villages were established, the lake was still there. And here I think if we really want to talk, as I'm trying to do, about these uses of the past and this embedding the past into something new, this part of the Egnatia Way, which is running on the foothills of the mountains, is really interesting and allows some comparison and some reflection on this point. You see here, it's the river Axios, very important, but I'm not into geography, but it's very important for all the migratory waves from the north to the south, and today from the south to the north. And we see how the presence of Pella, there are 2 colonies here. There is ancient Pella, which is the city of the birthplace of Alexander the Great, where he studied with Aristotle and so on. Pella was a port because the lake in antiquity was bigger, and it was a lake port, and that was very convenient for navigating and reaching the Thermaic Gulf. But number 2 is showing the Roman colony of Pella. So you really have this in these 2 places. So here is the case of Pella. This is also a refugee village, but reoccupied. It is a former village called Agi. So here the process in Greece is very different from Italy. There is no rhetoric at all. There is emergency. And in fact, what the Refugee Commission is doing is surveying all the available houses and villages abandoned by Turks or other minorities, so that before anything else, what is done is reoccupying, resettling abandoned villages. And that's the case of Pella, that is there, and it's in corresponding. You see here the juxtaposition between the ancient Pella, the Agora by the Egnatia Way, the palace, the Acropolis high up, and the village of Pella. Here the pattern is rather organic, and below you see some figures. These are just some pictures, and these are nice. We found them, and Axel was also there. We found them in a restaurant. There is a lot of pride everywhere you go, they are shown, but that's also so in the Pontine Plain. You see here pictures from I can imagine they are from the 50s, so on. And you see how this kind of daily rural life and how these antiquities are part of the scene. You say the mosaic to the left, but also you see that there is this casket or to the right, and these people finding some remains and carrying them elsewhere. And here is the site of Nea Pella, near to the Roman colony of Pella, with some figures about the number of families. And this is really a prototype, while in the case of Pontinia, Latina, Sabaudia, each town, there are some common denominators, but each town is site specific, and the architecture is specific, and each square has its character. Here is really copycat, because the emergency is great. So the grid is the best way. There is the technicalities of the grid, the road hierarchy, the main road, few public building, very few, because the Refugee Commission is paying for houses. It's not paying for the school or for the church, which are mostly self-built. In this case, I mean, reducing the fact to the minimum, the main road, like marking the backbone of the village, is set at right angles with the Via Egnatia. And the main buildings, the school and the church, are actually occupying a block, and are a self-standing building along the main road, which is then having a playing field that are merging into the countryside. Here are just some pictures, and I think this is the last picture. This is Egnatia Road as it was back in the 1999, and as you drive and you pass Pella, you see all these Macedonian tombs, all these tumuli that are tombs of the Macedonian generals, wooded tumuli. So there is this kind of ceremonial. It's a road. It's a very important. It's one of the main road linking the Adriatic Sea to Istanbul. And this, it was not like the Appian Way. It was something different. But this is what we see today. It was probably what was there, because these tumuli were there even when the colonization process got started. I might conclude by saying that most of the excavation work that brought to light Pella, Vergina, and the royal tombs, they actually happened in the 1970s. Somehow, here is the reverse. Like, resettling the area brought about a new interest for its archaeological significance. And in the 70s, the main findings were responding positively to the efforts, and Makaronas, who is an important Greek archaeologist, found the tomb of Philip II and the tombs of Vergina and so on. So many thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Cristina. So
stop sharing. Aspetta, stop sharing.
Yeah.
What to do? Aspetta, ask. Come si fa a finire di aspetta,
in alto.
Stop share, finito.
Okay. Thank you, Cristina. So I leave the floor to Axel. And so, Axel, are you there? Maybe no?
I am. Just
okay.
had to find the button.
Okay. Thank you, Axel.
Okay. Let's see how this works out. Now sharing screen. How is this? Are you getting a full screen? Your microphone is off, Federica.
Sorry, we cannot see your screen. We see you.
Okay.
Okay, now we are, okay, now we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Thank you, Federica, very much for the invitation. Thank you, Cristina, for your previous lecture. We've been working for a while with Cristina and a lot of other researchers, some of which I see are attending today. Today I'll try to talk about some topics that have kept me busy in the last months. Probably, as often happens, I will not really be able to deliver the results that I ambitiously announced in my abstract, but hopefully this will feed discussion. And I will do my best to make this fast. Basically here, I'll try to discuss major issues, design problems, and themes in rural planning and village design in the former Eastern Bloc. I will do this by discussing in parallel two kinds of figures, basically agricultural statistics, and don't worry, I will not delve in depth, and some images representing rural villages and rural architecture of the USSR and then mainly of Estonia. So to start with this, Soviet and socialist countries have produced agricultural statistics very early on and dedicated obviously much attention to the share of socialized agriculture against individual and private agriculture, especially during campaigns of forced collectivization. They quite early on adopted, by the way, the Viennese method of pictorial statistics, which I understood was a major school of infographics in the late 20s, 1930s, and onwards. They focused on the progress of collectivization and, for instance, on how the number of collective farms evolved. In parallel, they also focused on the share of state farms, or as they are called in the USSR, sovkhozy, or in the former GDR, the German Democratic Republic, VEGs, V-E-G, or collective farms, which are today known as kolkhozy in Soviet countries, or in the German Democratic Republic, LPGs. Don't ask me to pronounce the full word in German. They focused, on this these two different forms of collectivized agriculture, the collective farm and the state farm. And for instance, one sees quite quickly, looking at these statistics, how important the so-called collective farms were in regard to state farms. State farms always had a very limited share of the agricultural land and the number of settlements. Yet the state farms were the preferred form of farming. The fact is that, Soviets and socialists had great and beautiful ideas in part, but they basically had no plan on how to deal with socialist agriculture, at least in the Soviet Union early on. They wished to basically have a kind of state-controlled and state-driven agricultural sector, but were not really able to implement it. Therefore, the system of cooperative farm or collective farms, as they are called, took a much larger share and was basically run by farmers under the close supervision of the state. Now, some statistics do draw our attention, obviously, on issues of productivity and how many liters of milk a cow will produce every year and how it evolves over time and how each region is doing better or worse than others. But some statistics are of interest from our disciplinary perspective, which is architecture and planning, because they link the quantitative aspects of the agricultural production with its physical organization into space. And this is basically the average surface of settlements. So the visual charts on these aspects of size are much less abundant than others. Still, they exist. And I have tried to recollect the agricultural statistics of the Soviet Union and of some republics like Ukraine and Estonia over the whole duration of their socialist regimes, focusing especially on the number of farms, their average sizes, the differential number of state farms versus collective farms. And from there, one sees that there are kind of major periods which relate to major planning issues. And I'll try to go through this quite quickly and then illustrate my point. Now, for those acquainted with the history of the Soviet Union, you are aware that collectivization did not really start until the late 1920s. Collectivization of agriculture, at least, was voluntary, but basically there were relatively little, if not marginal amounts of collectivized farms. The state started putting up some state farms. There were some very enthusiastic militants who put agricultural communes, TOSI, as they call them, which are more similar to Western-style cooperatives, and a third type of collective farm, which were called artels. And those artels are what we call today kolkhozes in the Soviet Union. Now, basically in 1928, 1929, the real process of collectivization seriously started. And what we see in this chart is that the plain red line is the number of kolkhozes, which rises dramatically between 1929 and 1932-33, and was basically the result of a campaign of forced and very violent collectivization. In dashed line is the number of sovkhozy, which is really much, much, much less than the number of kolkhozy. And then the bars that you see in white is the average size of sovkhozy, and in purple, the average size of kolkhozy. Now, one sees that while sovkhozy were not many, their average size was much larger, and even more so in the second part of the 20th century. And the average size of kolkhozy, at least until 1950 approximately, were relatively small in comparison, a few hundreds of hectares. Basically, the pre-existing villages were transformed into cooperative villages. Their surface remained what it was. Their amount of inhabitants similarly slow, apart of those who were who died in the process dramatically. And reuse of existing building was the rule. Around 1929, the state started promoting a number of large grain state farms. And this is where we start seeing serious attempts and a significant number of new rural settlements, but those are sovkhozy. For the kolkhozy, the planning policy was reused, in fact, and for some of the new buildings, especially the productive facilities of for the collective villages, were mostly built on, if they ever were built, on the basis of catalogs produced by the Academy of Architecture. There were a few of those catalogs with standardized types for each kind of technical construction needed in those kind of farms. Kolkhozy, however, were basically too small, and this is one of the reasons why their physical shape did not change so much, because basically they did not reach the economies of scale capable of allowing them to increase their productivity and gain enough money to invest into new buildings. So because they were too small, and also because they lacked machinery, and especially people to operate the machines, the Soviets started implementing a third type of settlements, which existed from the early 30s until the late 50s, and then disappeared, which were called the machine tractor stations. Now, there was here, again, a significant effort on designing those farms, those machinery farms, also because they were state-driven and funded by the state, so they also had the means to do so. But basically, here are a number of ideal schemes for machine tractor stations, which I must say, in 10 years or more of working on 20th century rural planning, I have never seen in any Western literature. Now, after the war, basically, of course, there was a significant drop of settlements. Because the kolkhozy were too small, there was a campaign to amalgamate them. led by Khrushchev, right before Stalin died and before Khrushchev became the first secretary of the party. This basically dramatically decreased the number of kolkhozy, and by definition increased their average sizes. Also, it allowed to have a better control by the machine tractor stations who served the kolkhozy, because they were less to be controlled. There was also a point of trying to break basically the village bonds, the discretionary village bonds of the smaller kolkhozy, because they were deemed to be unproductive. This is one thing. So at that time, the main big planning issue for kolkhozy was that early on, from the mid-1930s, kolkhoz farmers were allowed to plot an individual farm, a small individual farm of about half an hectare to 1 hectare, for subsidiary farming. Now, agricultural historians discuss a lot on the fact that those subsidiary plots, which accounted for 1% of the farmland in the Soviet Union, produced 27% of the yields of the entire country. And probably this is the one reason why, according to some, the entire population of the Soviet Union did not disappear at that time, because they had some food somehow, at least from those subsidiary farms, claiming that the collectivized parts of the farm were unaffected. Now, this is a big discussion which I will not enter. My point here is that right there, we start having a big change, which is increased starting in 1961, which is the big inflection point, the big turning point. In 1961, the third program of the CPSU, of the Soviet Communist Party, states that they want to achieve the quality and the level of urban life in the countryside. And to do so, they basically need to have large villages, large enough to become towns, to become what they called at the time agrogorods. So basically, to do this, they incorporated a number of kolkhozy into existing sovkhozy, continued the amalgamation of several kolkhozy together, but also there were several plans at the regional or district scale to decide which village would survive and become an agrogorod, and which village would be in the long term abandoned. Now, the villages that they decided should become main villages, center villages, were called perspective villages, and those would receive all the investment and the support to build new public facilities, new schools, but also to move and transfer the settlers from their former houses into apartment blocks, which was also believed to be a typological model which was more favorable to socializing and having an urban style life in the countryside. And this is where we start seeing appearing a large number of planning schemes for new settlements, and these kind of new rural landscapes, which basically resemble very much workers' neighborhoods in the outskirts of major towns or around industrial towns. Now, to make, I made a long story very short, but basically to show that there are these 2-3 big important periods in planning, in rural planning and village architecture. I'll try to focus and illustrate a bit more the Estonian case, first of all, because it's different and perhaps more similar to Albania, because it became a Soviet republic in this, after the Second World War, although there was a short period of occupation already in 1940. And it is also very much similar to what happened in the GDR. Estonia is also quite interesting because, being digital Estonia, much of their archives are easily accessible online, which is useful when you study Estonia from Belgium. Now, little happened during the first year of Soviet occupation, and which was followed by German occupation until 1944. In 1944, when the Soviets reoccupied Estonia, as they did in Germany and in many other countries that joined the Eastern Bloc, they continued the land reforms that were started in the interwar period, allowing collectivization to happen on a voluntary basis. Now, one finds in the archives of the Estonian Museum of Architecture, the Museum of Estonian Architecture, a number of drawings and schemes related to this period, which are relatively invisible in architectural history scholarship, which is more focused on the period after the 70s, and I'll explain why. So we see this plan for a standard farm. It's unclear if this is already in the Soviet period or late standard plan for a land reform, an interwar land reform farm. But we see that in 1949, in Latvia, which was going through the same process, an Estonian architect is planning for a competition entry for a single farm. So I would believe that there was some production, intellectual production, design production for these land reform farms, even late in the 40s in Estonia too. We see that along with the voluntary phase of collectivization going on in Estonia, some architects started planning model plans for kolkhozes, with different layouts and patterns according to the side of the kolkhoz. There are more of these schemes, and again, it is very much unclear what this gentleman was trying to do, whether to help militants set up their kolkhozes or to gain some position in the new public administration. Now, in 1949-1950, there was a dramatic process of forced collectivization with deportation and mass murdering again. Here we see the dramatic increase of the number of kolkhozy, again in the plain blue line, and then a dramatic decrease because basically in 1951 in the USSR starts the amalgamation campaign, putting together smaller kolkhozy in order to make them larger. And you see that the size, the average size of the kolkhozy increases slowly until the 80s to be more or less as large as sovkhozy, around 3,000 hectares in the late 70s and 80s, which is large, but still much smaller than the average size of the collective and state farms in the Soviet Union. Now, in the Soviet Union, at the end of the process, a kolkhoz would be around 5,000 hectares large. Now, this is one single collective farm, which is as large as half of Paris. Okay, so 3,000 hectares is still quite large, It's a third of Paris. Now, to keep with my narrative, in the 50s, we see that following this process, there are a number of competition entries for standard dwellings. Here again, the model is the individual or twin cottage, as it was in pre-war times. There are a few plans for new kolkhozes in the 50s, including this one where one sees quite clearly the farm facility here, the dwellings, individual or twin, and then a public park with some public facilities and equipment. And again, the housing model is for a house or twin house with garden, but also some farmland for subsidiary plots, which was quite a headache for planners to make a kind of compact settlement with some kind of social life while having to work with the basic residential unit of a single house with a surrounding farming plot, although it was smaller than in previous periods. And then basically in Estonia, we see that there is a process very similar to that we saw in the Soviet Union, starting after the issuing of the third program of the CPSU in 1961. Basically, the number of kolkhozy decreases, the number of sovkhozy increases, their average sizes becomes more similar, and this is translated by the fact that Estonia issued in 1962, on your left hand, a general planning, a national planning scheme, which included the reorganization of the agricultural sector. Now, this image on the left has been around in modscapes in our research project for quite a while, although we were very much unable to understand exactly its significance and what it meant. And basically this planning scheme clearly establishes which former municipality is a sovkhoz, which one is a kolkhoz, but also which are the village centers, the perspective villages, which are to grow into larger small towns, and those villages which are doomed to abandonment and decline over time. This national planning scheme was paired by a number of more detailed schemes at the rayon or district scale, where the hierarchy of each settlement were clearly established. Now, this is perhaps a bit more clearer in this diagram, which is basically a redrawing of one of these previous rayon schemes, here for the district of Tartu, where one clearly sees the hierarchy between the major town or a small town, then the village center, a secondary center, and then the farms as such. There was a second wave of updating this hierarchy of settlements in the 70s, but the point is that basically starting from there, starting from the early 60s, this is when we see the beautiful Estonian kolkhoz and sovkhozes being built. New settlements, administrative buildings, schools, new saunas and theaters and clubs, and residential buildings. And those are the ones that are being dealt with mostly by the current scholarship. Obviously, they're much more beautiful. Those are the ones that are existing, most of them, while those of the previous time are more marginal in quantity and less of them have been built. Then again, we see clearly this idea of shifting to this ideal of an urban life in the countryside with apartment blocks and whatever having a larger amount of inhabitants into the village allows, including this very bold and recently discovered water tower, which is at the same time a water tower and an apartment block on the right hand. Now, I'm getting to the end. My point is that the attention has been on this beautiful building, but little on what preceded, at least in Estonia. An exercise of trying to overlap and checking if the buildings and the new kolkhozy and sovkhozy of the 60s, 70s, and 80s are actually built in what were designed to be prospective villages or not, has not been done. There is little relating the architectural or settlement design aspects with the planning aspects and the more strategic issues, but also relatively little effort to relate these architectural artifacts with agricultural issues and what the questions of size and how the farming systems are organized allows or does not allow for the settlement and the architectural forms. Now, I believe this is relatively important because agricultural history raises many relevant issues to frame and understand the significance of these architectural artifacts and settlements, such as issues of power struggle and social emancipation, or rather in this case of social coercion, issues of farming models and sustainability, and more largely of political economy. In addition, Soviet and socialist planners and architects made over the century great efforts to translate strategic issues of agricultural modernization into settlement patterns and architectural forms to make things work on the ground, but also to provide visual representation to these issues. Now, this is the case of these two mid-1980s books on rural segments and architectural design, but there are many more such books which I have not been able to retrieve yet, not to mention to read and analyze them. And all of this body of expertise, of theoretical debates, of formal solutions is, at least at the Western world, today fallen into oblivion. So apart from the built artifacts, therefore, and their potential heritage value, there is, I believe, an effort to be made, which is perhaps easier today than it was 20 years ago, an effort in reviewing this body of expertise to help situate the heritage value of the built artifacts, but also in the face that some similar issues are still at stake in the countryside, especially in the global south, but even more so recently under our latitudes. Now, there is no nostalgia to feed here, but we can probably learn something from the experiments and errors of the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Axel. And thank you, Cristina, for your interesting contributions. I can't read any questions in the chat, but I would like to make some remarks or comment about your interesting presentation. Well, what seems really, really clear is the different approach to agricultural and landscape issues and rural landscape issues made by two different, actually, also ideology, because in Italy we had the fascist party, and in the Eastern Bloc they were communists, so the approach was completely different. And what is interesting to underline, actually, is in the Axel presentation is some commonalities with, for instance, the Albanian case, for sure. And and this attempt actually to try to standard to make standard types also in developing this new rural architecture, which is not likely the case of the Italian rural development during the fascist period. But yeah, I mean, of course, there is a lot to do, to study and to do in this sense, because actually also the notion of modernist rural landscape is also quite recent. So we are talking about the last 30 years maybe. And I mean, someone started to define modernist rural landscape. I mean, for what concerns, for instance, the Albanian case only in the late 90s. So yeah, there is quite a lot to study and to do. For sure, modscapes was one of, I mean, the first project maybe that was dealing with this kind of issues. And it is important to go ahead and for sure make and build new research question what have already reached by your project, for instance. We have a question from Anissa, so please, Anissa.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. I had a question on a topic which might not be actually the main focus of your research, but it was kind of touched upon briefly by Cristina, and I wanted to ask Axel if he has an insight on that as well. Because Cristina did talk about pride, and she spoke from that. I had a sense of this relationship of the current population to what was before, and that's somewhat easier when it's a distant past and current politics are not that engaged, and debates are a bit less of a problem in some areas of the world, at least. But at least comparing it to Albania, there's a totally different relationship, I feel, of the current inhabitants with that recent past. And I was wondering if Axel has any insight on the cases that he brought from the Eastern Bloc, on what's that relationship now and what's the feeling, let's say, of the current inhabitants with this recent past landscape that they have inherited. Thank you.
Cristina, would you like to provide your perspective? No?
Me, I mean, I can add, I'm teaching a studio class with international students. And when they hear the history of this place, like they are working on Latina and the area, their reaction is immediately to pull down things, because this relationship with the recent past, now for the inhabitants of Latina, Pontine is not so, I don't think it's an issue. But whenever somebody's coming, like even we had some students from Berlin who we had a joint workshop in Pontine, for them it's shocking that the symbols of the fascist party are still in place, that nobody's doing nothing about it, so it's an issue in Italy as well. It's maybe less. It's more distant than in the case of Albania, but somehow it's still an issue. In the case of Greece, it's a totally different story, because the political party, I mean, there was a political scheme, of course, but there is no rhetoric. I mean, it's a different story. There is even when we went there, particularly in Neoskopos, we did many local workshops in Greece. And what we realized is that these people we were almost crying to the idea that the tragedy that to them it was personal was becoming somebody was taking care. I mean, was really studying what had happened to them. Like people in Neoskopos, they felt like almost they had to almost to be ashamed of having been refugees and having been poor. And many of the people who were farmers, they were actually not farmers when they came from Izmir or these places. So in that case, for them, the pride was, they started feeling pride for their situation. We went in Serres, we met a lot of people, and for that, to them, it was really important to see that. We also had some issue of kind of a guy who became very angry at us because we were funded by the European community, and so he got crazy about us when we, I mean, so it's still a heated story. I don't know, Axel, if you...
No, there's, I mean, so each country has its specific trajectory. And basically what is interesting about these built artifacts, this heritage, and the way it is remembered and enhanced, protected or not, in some cases, is that in a way or another, in each of the countries that we've been dealing with, perhaps not so much in North Africa, but in all of the others, it basically brings back to discussion major traumas in national history. Let's put it that way. In Estonia and in the GDR, people really don't want to, are not, yeah, they're beginning to be ready to talk about this period and to consider these artifacts as heritage, the younger generation. But there are technical problems. First technical problem is that most of the things that were built in Soviet countries is falling apart because it was so poorly built. And it is in remote locations, so one doesn't really know what to do with it. In the former GDR, it's a bit different. There's an issue of size because even the collective farms were very, very large, and they have these huge barns and buildings and hot houses and so on that are falling apart, and no one knows what to do with them because they are much too large to be managed by a single farmer. So this is part of the issue. But then when you come to a place like Italy, I believe that the fact that differently from Germany, for instance, after Second World War, there was no serious process of, no serious public debate on what happened during the fascist era, made so that a lot of people kept on nurturing some nostalgia or good memories of the time. And this happened very locally and was left to happen for a long time. Nowadays, this debate is not so heated anymore, but there is a clear interest, not on the ideological part of the heritage, but on trying to find some economical driver for development. And the built heritage is believed to be a potential driver to attract some kind of tourism and so on. So it's back. So there is some attention, and pride is part of it. People being pride of their public buildings and so on. And in Greece, from what I understood, the Greek refugees were really le dindon de la farce, as we say in French. They were a bit tricked because they expected for a lot of time in the 30s that they would get money back from what they left in Turkey, and they didn't, from their real estate and buildings and lands. And so they were very much considered as Class B citizens, I understood, Cristina, in the second part of the 20th century. So therefore, there are not a lot of major built artifacts there that deserve to be first-class heritage, but it's important to them to see this recognized, and so on. So each and every time you touch upon this, you touch upon major traumas and issues and tensions that happened within the country. at that time, and that are not often well cicatrized, cauterized, I would say. If you, there was this episode 10 years ago in a Francoist village in Spain, with the mayor wishing to change the name of the village, which was still entitled to the caudillo, Francisco Franco, and this raised major issues into national newspapers for just changing the name of one single village in the end of the world, basically. I don't know if this partially answers your question, Anissa.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
We had another raised hand by Nebi. Nebi, are you there?
Do you hear? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Actually, I raised the hand to raise the question, but Alex tackled in the end of his response. I mean, what I was interested to hear, but still, I can rephrase a bit more. I mean, my interest, what I am interested to hear is more how, if you can. I mean, I know it's a short time, but still, I'm interested to hear. The way how the political parties use the past in let's say during this period of time, starting from the fascist time till now in Italy, for instance, and what happened in case of Estonia or Russia, Soviet Union in general, because I mean, I'm interested to see the trajectory, how these political parties have used the past, and if there is any change during this time. I mean, how did they use the past to build, and how did they use the past to re-articulate the position of the architecture of the space, landscape, and so on and so forth. I know it's a large, it's a big issue, but still, I would, if you can contribute and give some of your feedback on how the politics use the past still and today on these remains and on these prospective villages that you mentioned in Estonia or in other cases. Or
well, I'm not a specialist on Estonia nor on socialist rural architecture. So my expertise is pretty much limited to what I discussed today. But I think this is a serious question. I am not aware of discussions in public debates among political entities, whether parties or not, around these issues in Estonia or Russia. Perhaps.
that's okay.
I know that.
I'm sorry.
No, you're welcome. I was jumping to Italy. I know that in Italy, for instance, in the area where which Cristina was talking about a lot, in the former Pontine marshes near to Rome, there is, since World War II, I mean, half of the population is leaning towards the right, not to say the far right. So what they call in social fascism or social neo-fascist parties. But I mean, and these parties have been rather active in promoting their heritage and their history in the past 40 years. And they keep on doing so. But it has become a quite consensual topic in these areas, even for left parties, because there is a common interest. Although I must say that the way this past is being remembered in Italy is sometimes a bit borderline, I would say, locally at least.
No, I would like to add some aspects that I think, I mean, I tend to, maybe because I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist, so I understand less about these aspects. But the paradox is that after the Second World War, all the huge effort of centuries, as I try to show, has been totally overlooked, because the fact that Latina found it was the northernmost part of the territory funded by Cassa del Mezzogiorno, which was a funding body for the development of southern Italy. So they established a lot of industrial units, even in the most fertile land. And I mean, there is a book which is tackling this issue, why the project failed, what happened to the farmers, and what was done in the place. Even a nuclear power station exists near Latina, which is really paradoxical. It's a paradox, but they may have, even if, for me, I kind of think that one should, it's not easy, but should separate the political meaning of things and the fact that these things cannot be dismantled. You cannot bring back the territory to the state it was before. It was not natural even before. There is an American scholar, Alan Berger, who from MIT, who is studying the area, and his point that the area should be renaturalized. My question would be to when exactly, because when was it natural? I mean, however, I mean, I invited him before COVID, but he said that he's not, I mean, then he said, I'm not traveling because of climate change, and many people are increasingly sensitive to the issue. So I want to get back to him and to see if he's available, at least online. But what I'm saying is that the place has been, maybe the symbols have remained, but the reclamation system and the potential for agriculture has been seriously harmed by the political decision taken after the Second World War.
Thank you, Cristina, and thank you, Axel. And maybe you want to add something?
No.
Okay.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you. There is a question from Elena in the chat. I'm going to read the question. Hello, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I have a question regarding the cooperative villages and their similarity with urban life and how they affect the nowadays rural life. Are they abandoned or used? If so, in what way? I think that is addressed to both of you, and so please. Maybe Axel, you can start.
Yes, right. Thank you, Elena. So basically, there is this idea in classical socialist ideologies, socialist thought, let's put it this way, that farmers were reactionary by definition, and peasants would not support any kind of socialist revolution because they are peasants and all they want is the stability of knowing what land they would be farming next year or next 10 years better. So there has been a kind of ideological conflict around this alleged innate way of behaving of peasants. And therefore there was early in the 20s already a lot of discussion on how to change this set of this mindset. And the idea was, well, we should basically urbanize them, but still we need them in the countryside to make the food. So how do we get urban life to them? Well, basically by bringing theaters, library, culture, schooling, education, health services, and so on, that are available in cities and not necessarily in the countryside, at least at that time. But to do so, you need a critical mass of inhabitants. And this has been a typical question in regional planning, even in the Western world, for how to develop rural areas and allow them to increase their quality of life. So how to make sure that people that are rather less concentrated than in cities are in the same spots in enough numbers to have a school and a hospital and whatever you need. So that's the main idea, and this is why there was so much insistence on trying to bring them together. Well, in parallel, there was the idea of industrializing agriculture, and therefore large surfaces were needed in order to have a tractor being used in an optimal way. So those two drivers combined made that they wanted to have larger settlements. And by having larger settlements, it was then economic to bring all these services. So this kind of attempts to respond to the first part of the question. Now, to which extent those cooperative villages had really urban life, I would say they didn't, but they probably had more urban life than they had before collectivization. In the most dispersed parts of the countryside. How this affects the rural life today, I wouldn't know. I mean, at least in Estonia, what I could see is that the general trends of the Western world of people moving to cities or at least suburban areas has happened there as well. Most of the collective facilities and buildings of the collective villages are abandoned. What is often still in use are the dwellings, but still then there is a trend towards rebuilding new buildings or revamping the old single family houses and farms.
Thank you, Axel. Cristina, you want to add something? Or?
I mean, the cooperative aspect of the reclamation in Italy, I mean, first of all, one of the aspects of the Italian case is that everything lasted 10 years, like roughly. The villages were meant to be cooperative agricultural management, agencies. But then everything was dismantled. They were meant that the interesting aspect is that there was a kind of a double system of affiliation. For some services, the farmers would refer directly to the town, the new town of proximity. But for what concerned the production, they were referring to Opera Nazionale Combattenti, and that was Rome, and it had its premises in each of the borgo. So they had a double reference point. The new town and the Opera Nazionale Combattenti, the local representative of the Opera Nazionale Combattenti.
Thank you, Cristina. We have another question. So Michele, you can switch on your audio and ask for your question.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Ciao Cristina and ciao Axel.
Ciao Michele, nice to see you.
So there is one thing that always come up when you read about rural development and particularly on the modernization approach to rural development, which is divide. It's a word that keeps appearing, you know, in the literature and the words of the architects, the politicians, and so on. So it's typically a divide between urban life, urban economy, urban society, and rural society, rural life. But it's also the divide between regions, you know. Typically in the English literature and also in the French literature, which is the one I'm working on, the rural development and the rural modernization is a matter of catching up, you know. If you think about, for example, the TVI experience, the Tennessee Valley experience in the US, the idea is we have within the big scale, national scale, we have this region which is particularly backward. We need to do something for catching up this divide. And the whole debate is whether, how much divide is acceptable or not. So the impression I have while listening to your presentation is that although we tend to assume that the English approach to regional development is the standard one, which is the only one and progressively spread around the world. I have the impression that the examples that Cristina and Axel described are kind of depicting a different idea concerning this aspect. It is quite clear in the Soviet example, first of all, because if you think about regional differences, well, there's not that much that thing because it's applied to the whole national scale. It might be the same for the Greek case study, even though I'm not sure whether there was anything concerning those aspects, because it was maybe mostly an emergency measure, and I don't know enough to say if there was any thought about these aspects. And I don't know for the fascist Italian case, because I know regional divide and the catching up of backward regions is something that comes out very strongly in the post-war Italian scenario, but I don't know how much it was already present in the fascist period. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, if you have any idea concerning those aspects.
I may say something, but I think, for example, this notion of regional planning, and I've been reading some books dating back to the 1930s, 1940s by British planners. I think it comes, I mean, you are saying that somehow these case studies are showing a different path. For me, we should never forget the concrete dimension of reclamation, which is a catchment area. So it has to do with, I mean, there is a, before even the administration, like in political terms, there is an area which is cohesively functioning. And Alex Coroglia is here, and he has written a chapter on technical landscape. And one of his points that the landscape is a kind of territorial machine. So that puts in place a notion of cohesiveness of a certain territory, which is beyond the political, how do you say, boundaries. And in the case of Greece and Italy, for me, are emphasizing a big difference. The Pontine Plain is kind of the garden of Rome, because, you know, there was the Eur. So you had Rome, the new Rome, and then you were heading towards the Pontine Plain. So that was a matter, it was a showcase, I think, the Pontine Plain project also. It was a showcase because initially Mussolini didn't mean to build cities, and then they were built. In the case of Italy, the region is the frontier. Athens is below, I mean, is down to the south, and that is the new frontier. Like in a matter of years, the frontier has changed. Before Thessaloniki has become Greek, and an entire territory is being resettled, like northern Greece. And the regional aspects come into play from concrete terms, like the University of Salonika is specialized in the technical disciplines that are useful to, like, the technicians, the agronomists, not only, but so I think there is a concrete dimension that is like, is bottom up, this regional thing. I don't know if I added anything to your comments. Because the regions are all different in Italy, like Apulia. We have studied Apulia, we went there. it's totally different case. Like, but this difference comes not from the abstract level of what the regional planning should be, but from the actual conditions. Like in Apulia, for example, the Dowers Pass, the Tratturi, most of them are no longer there because they have been converted into roads. They needed roads. They had the Tratturi. They converted Tratturi into roads. They challenged animal breeding. I mean, but in a way, the regions in Italy are so different that when they put their hands really with the intent to change radically from a situation to another, they couldn't but come to terms with this the specificity of the sites of the region and even how people behaved. Like, for example, in Apulia, the farmers were not living onto their plot, the allotment. So really, there are many, many differences. As you say, probably the kind of theoretical we have noticed we started looking at a lot of exchanges, and like Piccinato was going to the conferences organized by the town planning institution. So there was a lot of exchange. I don't think that the Italians didn't know about the theories about regional planning, but somehow things have, I mean, the specificity of the Italian territory, at least then, maybe not now, imposed some experimental attitude. That's my point. I don't know, I might be wrong.
I think that you're right, Cristina. And also another interesting case was the reclamation of the Lago del Fucino in Abruzzo in 1950s was another case. Okay, after the, I mean, in the second half of the 20th century, but was another interesting case of agricultural transformation of a pre-existing landscape, for instance. I don't know if there are other questions, but we are quite... Yes, Axel?
Oh, I'd like to add something, but then perhaps
yeah.
Sure. I'm not sure if you're putting your question on different epistemologies of development or on regional planning as such. What I can tell is that in the case studies that we've been looking at, finding paths for rural development had to do with two main issues. First of all, the issue of national competitivity. There was a need to increase production and wealth, not because wealth was some kind of new divinity, but because there was a risk that the neighboring nation would invade you and eat you up. So you need to be and have a strong economy. In order to do that, you need food. Now, if you look at the numbers, how many people were settled in the countryside and were farmers at the beginning of the 20th century, and how many were at the end, at least if you look at the figures in the socialist countries, basically the numbers remain stable. Okay? Meaning people have been kept in the countryside with the same farming surface. So that's the headache. How do you increase the amount of product by the same number of people on the same amount of surface? So the big hope was mechanization and introns and developing seeds and so on, and reorganizing and rationalizing the production, which turned out to be not so very efficient when it was in planned economies, let's say it that way. But eventually it fed the Eastern Bloc for a while. The other point is whether or not, and this was the hypothesis of the fascist agrarians, agronomists, whether or not you see as inevitable the fact that sooner or later, whenever at least the system of production allows to free people from the countryside, you allow them to come to the city, okay, will you do so? So in the socialist countries, they didn't let them do so, and neither did they in Greece. In fact, this is, I remember Cristina reading that there was a clear statement by the Commission for Refugees that cities were not able to absorb in their urban economies all of these people from the countryside or the refugees. So this is why they needed to be kept on the land. Okay. But for Serpieri, the agronomist who imagined the fascist reclamation and rural development policy, there was the idea of keeping a part of the society as being a rural society disconnected from the urban society. And in their single individual farm based on the family, the village, the church eventually, and that was it. I think this was not the case in many other countries. In many other countries, the case was, well, we'll keep them in the countryside as long as we need to, but once they can come to the city, let's have them in the city, or let's have the city in the countryside. But there was no strong idea of dividing those two worlds. And in fact, part of the solution came when alternative patterns of settlement, alternative urbanization patterns came up, like suburban areas, which was the alternative between either urban or rural, but no, you can have both basically. Without having big cities, you can have industry in the countryside and whatever. I don't know if this kind of puts the finger on the point you were raising, Michele, but in any case, nowadays, I think we cannot think in these terms anymore. The conditions have changed and the needs have changed. So much of the rural development debate goes over endogenous rural development rather than trying to build this relationship between city and countryside.
May I just add something very, very quickly? I know we are a bit late. I think when you show the map of Estonia, the one that you said it's been around, we saw it in our Modscape project since the beginning, and we didn't know exactly how to interpret it. One thing that came to my mind when you showed it earlier is that, well, in a certain tradition of rural development and regional planning, there is this thing, as I said, of catching up a divide. And so there is a backward region, and the debate is centered around how much are we willing to transfer in terms of resources, in terms of population, from one region to the other. A major difference, I think, in the case of Estonia, at least, in the case of the Soviet, of the collectivization of the Soviet Union, is that this dimension does not exist. It's a whole country. The regional, the inter-regional differences are not part of the game. I don't know what we can draw from this consideration. I'm not even sure it's accurate, but I don't know. It's a kind of a reflection thing that came to my mind when you showed that map. That was maybe the reason, why I asked that question.
I get it. Perhaps partially true for Estonia, which is small, not true for Ukraine or the Soviet Union, which is much larger.
Maybe not true also for Albania, because they had this kind of distinction between agricultural cooperatives in the plain, then in the hilly sites, and in the mountainous rural area. So, yeah.
Besides, I guess they had a passport system for traveling in the country and recruiting workers for industrial towns and factories as they did in the Soviet Union, no? In the Soviet Union, you were not allowed to travel and to go and settle elsewhere if you did not have, if it didn't meet planning expectations. So if you were not needed elsewhere, you were not allowed to do so.
I don't know exactly in Albania. Maybe you know something if people were allowed to go to other villages or areas?
If I have, I mean, there was. Do you hear me now? Yes. Okay. I don't know exactly the time when the state decided this system of passportization that they called during the socialist time, and for every movement from the one village to another village, but particularly from one district to another district, was state who decided for you if you had the right to move or not, particularly when you move from the village to urban area. So it was quite difficult to have this permission. It was kind of having a new citizenship if you move from the village to Tirana, for instance. And for that reason, state had, I think in the mid of 70s, had promoted the idea to make the village like a city, and encouraging people to move to live in the village, and also even cinema, socialist cinema was get involved in that issue by producing, and also literature had produced a lot during that time, the ideal type that the best way is to, the best example to show that you are a socialist man, a new socialist man, is to move from the urban to rural area, to sacrifice, to give your contribution to the country, and so on and so forth. Which was basically a very interesting point, because in the mid of 70s, many changes happened in Eastern Bloc. But Albania was the case when they had decided to keep going on collectivization and to extend the collectivization, and the idea of, for many reasons, but I'm making short, Albania encouraged the life in the village because of the economy and so on and so forth. So this is basically what came to me in mind now to contribute on this debate, but I'm not sure if I have contributed anyhow. I'm not sure if you are hearing me or not, because
we are hearing
it's so
you.
strange, this virtual. Yeah.
Yes, we're hearing you. Yeah, and what you said, it was actually super interesting, because actually the housing was one of the main problems for the architects or for the Ministry of Construction, for instance. The housing problems was quite a big deal during the socialist regime in Albania. And yes, I mean, there are a lot of, I mean, as I said, Albania is quite an anomaly in the socialist country. So this is also interesting to investigate.
Albania was really Stalinist in a way. So
exactly. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to close this meeting. But before closing, I would like to remind you that there will be other 2 meetings within this webinar cycle. The next one will be next week on April 29, and will be a meeting dedicated to conservation of cultural landscapes, especially sustainable management of cultural landscapes. And our speaker will be Bosse Lagervis, that is an associate professor from the Gothenburg University in Sweden. So thank you again, Axel and Cristina, for being here and for having contributed to this webinar cycle. And thank you to all of you for participating in this webinar.
Grazie, thank you.
Thank you, Federica, for the invitation. congratulations for the nice webinar. I'm looking forward to watch the videos on YouTube as well.
For sure. Thank you.
Look
Ciao.
forward.
Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao Ale. Ciao Axel.